Okay, let's get started. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to Nurturing the Spirit of Children in a Challenging World, a free webinar from Search Institute, and in this time in collaboration with Fuller Theological Seminary. We're glad you're here. I'm Michael. I'm Senior Learning Experience Manager at Search, and we are here to help people like you build strong relationships with young people so that they can all thrive. We put on many webinars and workshops like this one, and you can check out searchinstitute.org for more on upcoming webinars and workshops. And today we're going to be hearing from Dr. Rolke Partain and Dr. Rojas Flores. I'm going to give some introductions, some information for all of you in attendance, and then I'll turn it over to Jean. Jean and I are in the Minneapolis offices and of Search Institute, and Liseth is in Pasadena, California at Fuller Seminary. And I have a hunch that we're all joining this webinar from a lot of different places. So how about you? Like, we would love to know, please put in the chat your location and the organization that you're representing. We'd love to know a little bit more about you as we begin this webinar. So feel free to write that in the chat. And while you're doing that, I'll give some introductions. So Dr. Jean Rolke Partain is Search Institute's senior scholar for over 30 years. And Jean has been on the cutting edge of our research at Search, writing over 200 publications, from blog posts to peer-reviewed articles, from short video series to multi-year research projects. And all of this work is in the service of trying to understand what helps young people thrive. He's given special attention to the role of families and religious traditions in helping young people develop. And these are topics that we have consistently studied at Search Institute since its founding in 1958. So we're looking forward to hearing from him on a current research project on the spiritual development of young people. We're also really honored to have with us Dr. Liseth Rojas Flores, a licensed clinical psychologist and professor of clinical psychology at Fuller Theological Seminary. And in her research, she examines how trauma, community violence, and sociocultural adversity affects children's and families' holistic well-being and develops resources to support their resiliency. Currently, with support from World Vision, Dr. Rojas Flores and her team are looking at the implementation and effectiveness of Christian faith-based parenting programs in 3 world regions: Africa, Asia, and Central America. She also investigates the impacts of internal displacement in Colombia and community violence among children of immigrants and families in the United States and Latin America. So this is very timely research. We're very grateful for her to be here. Her work is funded by the Foundation for Child Development, explores the effects of parent-child separation on Latino citizen children due to immigration enforcement. Dr. Rojas Flores is dedicated to fostering resilience in children and their families and helping them thrive in challenging environments. A note about Search: we partner with organizations. We partner with organizations like you. We partner with you to conduct and apply research promoting positive youth development that advances equity so all people have what they need to thrive. We have about over 60 years of history conducting this research. And more than that, we are very passionate about using that data and research to make practical resources and tools that help you as you build relationships with your young people. Spiritual development has been a research topic we've been interested in a long time, many decades, and Search Institute is here for you, whatever issues you might be facing on that topic and the young people that you work with. Just so you know, Ella, our partner relationship specialist, is in the chat. She shared with you a handout. It's very at the top of the chat. You'll find that there. Jean has prepared a handout for today's webinar. Ella is available to work with you directly if you have questions about how to partner with Search Institute. And Brandon, our research coordinator, is also in the chat. And so that's it. So today we're specifically answering this question. I'm going to hand over to Jean. How might spirituality contribute to thriving during childhood? It's a question we're all asking, and we hope that today's webinar, where they will be talking about the domains of spiritual development, insights from the field, and one statistic that keeps religious leaders up at night. We hope that inspires you to ask questions in your own context as well. At the end of this webinar, you'll be equipped to explore how you want to engage spiritual development with young people. And there's also going to be time for Q&A at the end. So if you have questions, please put that in the Q&A portion of the webinar. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass it over to Jean.
Well, thanks, Michael. It's great to be with everyone today. I was looking through the chat and seeing folks I know, folks I'd love to get to know. So looking forward to our conversation today. And so thanks so much for that. Um, let's see, where do we even start here? Um, this is a big conversation, work that I've been involved in for a good long time. And so I'm looking forward to just diving in with you. Here's what we're going to cover today. Our agenda today is really to jump into how do we think about some of the research and practice gaps, really focusing on middle childhood and the elementary years as we might think about them, and what the potential is in these years, which are sometimes called the forgotten years. We're really thinking a lot about the connection between children, their families, and the supportive institutions around them, and how do we begin to get beyond sort of the idea that parents are the ones who oftentimes get blamed for the gaps. So how are we going to move beyond that? And then we'll jump into a conversation with you about that. And Liseth will be my conversation partner through all of this. Liseth is the advisor on a project we're just getting started with and not too long ago. And so that builds on the research we'll talk about today. And so I wanted to get her involved in the conversation here today. So without further ado, I'll jump into that. Here's the project that we're talking about today is one we did with support with organization at Presbyterian Seminary in Virginia with support from the Lilly Endowment. And really the idea there was how do we understand what's happening in the field, sort of mapping the field around what's going on with this age group in the literature. We did a survey of parenting adults. We did some interviews with some families, and we had conversations with a bunch of experts, both practitioners and scholars, about can we understand what's going on during the elementary years or the middle childhood, as we called it. And so that's really, we put that together, try to find a story to tell. What's the story to tell? How do we think about this age group and what's going on in their lives? And really, what are the connections between these three? So there's a lot of other research out there around effective programs or programs that aren't effective. There's stuff about that's happening with chaplains and other things around spirituality with this age of children, but we really were focusing in on the connections between these three parts of thinking about spiritual thriving or spiritual development with these three players. And to jump to the headline, there's a lot of disconnection between these three institutions, and that's sort of where our next phase of research has gone. So we'll talk more about that as we jump into it. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing it because we just want to jump in and give time for talking. So we'll talk about the research and practice gaps, just to sort of say where we found that working. So I talked about this being the forgotten years. There's other words for it that people use. There's a strong research base in early childhood generally, a relatively decent and burgeoning base around spirituality in early childhood. There's a strong, you could debate how strong base around adolescence and the research base there around spirituality and religion in adolescence. Chris Smith is one of the strong researchers who's done a lot of work on religion, spirituality, and adolescence. So there's a lot going on there. There's really kind of a gap in between. There's a lot on some programming for elementary kids, but there's more of a gap in between in terms of thinking about the connection of family, spiritual development, and how those work together. And then what are the institutional connections that support families during this time? So to give you a sense of that, we've got this, and development is still happening then, by the way, even though we sometimes don't think about it. So we looked between 1997 and 2021 at what the literature there we could find, mainly in the academic scientific literature. And we found that, there were publications there. We found 116 publications total. There's other publications that looked at looking at, for example, death and dying and what role chaplains play in that. It's good stuff, really interesting stuff. But on average, there's about 8 publications a year that are looking at families and children in this age group. and only half of them introduce new data. The others are more, let's synthesize what's out there, let's talk about a theory or those kind of things. And only about 17 of look at the role of families and parents in this age group. And most of them really focus then on the role of parenting adult, less on the child, and very few on the family as a system. So if you think about that. And then the last piece, there's no major longitudinal studies. And I talked to a lot of the researchers out there and say, do you guys know any longitudinal studies? And no one really did. So if you do, let me know about it. I'd love to see those, because there just seems to be a gap there. And we ask the practitioners too, is it sort of what's the state of the literature, the available resources for really understanding what's, they're really based in the science and what we know about child development for this age group. And most were sort of like, there's not a whole lot out there. And, one of the scholars said, there's not a lot for this age research. There's a lot more for early childhood and adolescence. And most have kind of assumed that third graders are kind of like sixth graders in terms of what the materials are for them. So that's kind of what you would, the gap that you would see. So I guess, Liseth, how would you see that? How would you think about that from your perspective in the field?
Thank you, Jane. I do agree with you. I think that we all recognize the importance of middle childhood, and especially you're describing here a growing concern that this stage is unrepresented in the research, and I would say it also policy in many ways. And as a researcher working here in the U.S. and abroad, I see that middle childhood is often omitted from national and global research agendas and targeted family focused strategies, and that often lead to this lack of age appropriate focus and interventions. And mind you, this gap that you're talking about is even greater for historically marginalized children in the US, Latinos and African American children. And less is known about special topics like you were highlighting, such as spiritual development and thriving among school-age children. So it's a big problem. It's a pressing need, and we need to have more comprehensive research conversations that allow us to dream and implement key strategies to support the unique developmental needs of children in this age group. So I'm with you on this one.
Yeah, thank you. And it's not to say that the other ages aren't important too, just for the record. It's just that there seems to be a little bit of gap here. So let's turn and start looking then at what's the potential of these years in terms of what's going on in terms of the research. And so before we get too heavy about it, one of the parents we talked to sort of framed it this way, and I'll read this because it's kind of long. My youngest is 7. He really doesn't care too much about it. Talking about spirituality. I just hope he wants to be a good man in our society right now, which I guess is a spiritual thing. But I haven't really had time to think about that too much yet. So we're just basically trying to be nice to our sisters and, not have a potty mouth or be gross. So a lot of the parents we talk to sort of are trying to just get through the day with a lot going on. This mom has 3 kids. There's a lot going on in life and just trying to make it through the day. And as we'll show you, this is not that different than a lot of other things. So when this mom talks about a spiritual thing, that's kind of as far as some families are getting as they're thinking about it. And so what do we really mean by that? What is that? And it's obviously a fraught conversation in many places. And as we could spend many weeks just having a debate about what it is. So at Search, we've been thinking about it, working on it. We had the study we did of adolescence. We worked with a bunch of scholars, I think about 120 scholars around the world, scholars and practitioners who were thinking about it. And we did a Delphi study, for those of you who know what that is, trying to come to a sense of what that might be. We're still not completely satisfied with it, but we like to say spiritual development is in part to say it's kind of, here's what we know so far, some things. And so for us, at the core of it, there's a hand in your handout, there's a long page description of this if you want to read more. And where there's a sense of awareness of oneself, awareness of the world around you, awareness of the divine. That's part of what spiritual development is. There's a sense of belonging and connectedness to others, sense of relationship as being at the core of it. And there's a way of living, if you will, a way this sense of awareness of the divine translates into an integrated life, an ethical life, and those kinds of things. And all of these are part of spiritual development. They're all part of life. And different religious traditions may emphasize one over the other, for example. And so, for example, some in the Jewish tradition may say we emphasize the way of living, the practices of our faith, and the ethical way of being. Whereas some might in the Christian tradition might emphasize more the awareness and the connection to God, and that piece as more of an emphasis. And again, it would vary by different people. So I wouldn't say it's any one or the other by themselves. But it's not all that is, because that varies by social contexts. Some of the folks that Liseth works with who are in violent areas or would have a very different maybe understanding of how that actually shows up in their lives than people who are in maybe a different context or different cultural contexts. So those things vary. It also varies by culture, and then it's connected to different meta narratives. So one's scriptures, one's the sacred writings, or the cultural writings in a different the culture of the United States versus, say, the culture of an African country. Those things would affect how you understand and think about your the spirituality and how it takes shape in one's life. So I'll stop there for a minute, and Liseth, you want to comment on how you see this playing out in some of the work you do in terms of how spiritual development either is consistent with or different languages being used to describe some of these same things?
Apologies, let me unmute myself. Yes, thank you for this depiction of spirituality. I really, for me, what it highlights, Jean, is how children's spirituality must be protected and affirmed by all sectors of our society, right? Families, schools, churches, educational institutions. You have this ecological model that has to come together to support the holistic development of children. And the holistic development of children really encompasses not just the physical, the cognitive, or the social or emotional domain of the life of a child, but also the spiritual. So, thanks for affirming that, because in fact, spirituality is a multifaceted aspect of the children's development. And I see it, in my work. It's exciting to see how you come in learning from this research, and how other different research groups and science in general, and even religions and spiritual traditions are really paying attention to spirituality and understanding that there are conditions that are necessary to promote these essential elements of spirituality that you're talking about. It reminds me of my work with World Vision. We are working to investigate the effectiveness of a Christian faith-based parenting program in 12 countries. And this parenting program, faith-based parenting program, is aimed at reducing harsh parenting, but also promoting the spiritual nurture of children. And within that theory of change, we realize that we have to pay attention to the context, to the conditions that will nurture or not the spirituality of the children, their holistic development. And we landed in similar concepts that you have mentioned here, right? They belong, believe, and become for us, but these essential conditions are related to fostering child spirituality. So you mentioned belonging, right? For a child to belong, they must feel safe. They must feel valued, cared for. They need to grow in nurturing relationships, safe relationship with parents, with caregivers, with adults. You talk about awareness of the divine. And for a child to develop that awareness of the transcendence, the divine, which is pretty innate in there, they need to grow in these safe environments, free of violence, because we know from trauma and violence that if you're not in these safe environments, it's going to tamper with your spirituality and your relationship with others. And you talk about the weight of living, right? That children need opportunities to practice, to develop agency, to internalize ethical values, and to practice these ethical values with others. So I agree with what you're saying here. And for me, a big takeaway is that we need to promote the spiritual nurture of kids. All adults must do that. We must remove barriers. This is something that World Vision emphasizes. We must remove barriers. And especially for adults that are in the immediate surrounding of the child, and in this case, often families and parents, but even those farther away, like the teacher, the faith leaders, the institutions, they all must rally around the child to foster this sense of belonging, promoting the exploration and provide of the divine and the trust of in spirituality, and in providing these empowering opportunities for children to discover and practice an ethical way of living in community.
Great, thank you. The last thing I'll say is tying this, that spiritual development doesn't happen disconnected from the rest of children's lives. It's interconnected with the other areas of development. So obviously, the way they're thinking cognitively, their social emotional development, even their physical development is integrated with and connected to their spiritual development. And that's where I think the opportunities for spiritual development get really interesting as we think about that during middle childhood. So if you think about some of the developmental shifts that are happening in middle childhood, kids are moving from being more self-focused when they're much younger to being more other-focused. And these are part of what's happening during middle childhood. They're moving from more simple ideas to more systems ideas, where they're connecting ideas together. And they're moving from co-regulation, where the way they work is connected to their parenting adults or other caregivers, where that's the co-regulation is happening, to more self-regulation. And this is an ongoing process, happens differently for different young people. But these all become ways to think about, how do we think about nurturing spiritual development, where we begin to think all of these things are beginning to think about how we think about relationships and empathy, deep learning and meaning making, autonomy and creative expression, all of which, from my perspective, are really opportunities for thinking about spiritual development. So just want to play you a quick clip from one of the people we interviewed, one of our advisors on the project, and just how she framed it in this case.
And then, with middle childhood kids, the way they think, they're still concrete, they're not abstract thinkers yet. And so I think that, but they're moving toward that. So they're going to start asking questions. And so I think the whole idea of, teachable moments in terms of questions about God or the meaning of life, that's what the parents, should jump on. Or like your, Disney movies and whatever, they have this kind of hidden philosophy, and you could talk about that. If a kid, when the fifth grader starts noticing contradictions in what people say, so again, it's just sharing with them, not in a way of lecturing, but in a way of modeling how they process the world through that spiritual framework.
Yeah, so this notion of deep learning becomes a big part of the elementary years. And one of the folks we talked about how this is, kids get absorbed in like a project that they're really into, and they can just go hours playing Legos or whatever it might be. And one of her concerns was the idea that that's becoming harder to do if they get overabsorbed in like social media, and can begin to undermine the ability to do this deep thinking and beginning to set the stage for meaning making. Again, you're not going to sort of do the work of adolescence during the elementary years, but it does create the habits where you can do reflective things, you begin to move in those directions. if we create space for that, of keeping those eyes open for wonder and those things during the middle childhood years. So that's one of the opportunities we have if we continue to nurture it in children.
And then, with middle childhood kids,
So if we if we think about all of those different things, is there's those different areas, and we're not going to go in all these in depth because we only have a limited amount of time. But to begin to think about how do we look at the different opportunities there for relationships, deep thinking, autonomy, creative expression, and then what are the practices we can do? And there's a handout where we try to draw some of these things out. It's more than we can cover in this today, but I wanted you to have something that was very practical, say, these are the practices we can begin cultivating with children and adapting them within each of our traditions, and even in non-religious settings, to say, how can we begin cultivating these things in a way that cultivates their spiritual lives? And so that we can go deeper with those things if they're with people and in environments that allow those things to be nurtured. And so that's where the opportunity comes. I should take a breath, and Lisette, see if you have something you want to add there to these ideas, particularly around the relationships and things.
Yes, I think it goes back to some of the things I mentioned before. I'm a trauma specialist, and for me, safe environments are very, very important. And you talk about kids developing a deep thinking and being able to wonder and tap into the innate spirituality. And I think also of the barriers that will not allow that innate spirituality to flourish. And precisely, it relates to the lack of safe environments and the unique opportunity for adults to provide that safety where children can flourish. It starts with the family, right? It's hard in other the other institutions and adults surrounding the child. Because it's hard for a child to do deep thinking, to wonder if they are afraid for their own safety, if they're exposed to some form of abuse in the home, harsh parenting, corporal punishment, and any other larger social structural policies that do not protect a child. They do tamper with that ability for children to formulate their own existential reason and hope for being and develop their spirituality. There are barriers to belonging, like you were mentioning before, to experiencing close relationship with others and even with God. The meaning making, it's based on that we make about the reason we're here and our purpose in life. It's based on our relationship with others. And for a child who is relying on parents and caregivers and adults, this is extremely important. So we must be paying attention about creating these safe, nurture environments that will allow the child to flourish spiritually. Some researchers have gone as far as calling this exposure to violence in different shapes and forms as a reverse spirituality, because the meaning making often unravels when a child grows up in an unsafe environment. So I would just add that point in here, and how important and how all of these issues are so interconnected. We can't just say, let's foster spirituality without laying the ground with safe nurture environments.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Okay, so then that takes us to the next piece around looking at families and the family role in this. And you've sort of opened the door for that first piece about what are the headwinds that are facing families. And there's the people we talked to, you've talked about some of the really heavy environments that some face. There's also some cultural norms. Some of the families we talked to say it's kind of calm right now for the kids developmentally, so we're just kind of letting them slide while we brace for the teen years. And there's all kinds of problems with that, but it's something out there of why some institutions and some families don't spend as much intentional times in middle childhood. because it's kind of it's a easier time, if you will, sometimes they'll say. With parents having sole responsibility for kids, not always connecting with institutions. Some will say this isn't our role. That's why we take them to church, mosque, or synagogue. Many are overstructured, overscheduled. Some are understructured because of issues of poverty. And then there's approaches to spiritual formation that are not actually, and this is in the handout as well, that actually aren't conducive to the kind of deep thinking we're talking about, where it's really aimed at games, playing, memorization, some other things like that, that actually are not conducive to the kind of spiritual formation we're talking about. And so I'm not going to go through all these in depth. Again, it's on the handout, but people from minority faith traditions have another layer of complexity that they're dealing with around cultural conflicts, potentially interfaith conflicts within the family that also can make it difficult. And then if a parent has had negative experience in childhood, or there's some trauma there that Liseth has talked about, those that can also be the kind of things that also then undermine the capacity of a family to really focus around healthy spiritual nurture in the family. We in a survey of parents, this is also just interesting, and it goes back to some of the stuff we talked about earlier. We asked, this is about 700 parents, parenting adults in a survey in the general population on an online sample. We asked sort of, what are the character strengths that you, and what are the things you would prioritize a high priority for you with your children in this age group? And you'll see many of the things that come up the top are really character strengths, treating with respect, as the parent said early on. I just want my kid to be a good citizen, kind of things. And then you'll notice that at the very bottom, the things that are explicitly religious or spiritual were the things that they were least likely to put in the top of the list. There's some other things in between. The list was quite long. And so, but of course, you'll notice that those are at 2/3 of parents are saying these things are things that are important to them. It's in some ways, and that's actually more than people who attend religious services on a weekly basis. That's just an interesting point. So this is where we get to saying, well, these are not high priorities for parents. But if you think holistically about what spiritual development is around a way of living, a way of belonging, and a way of connecting and awareness of the divine and the world, then you start thinking about this stuff maybe a little bit differently. So I'll just leave that with you. But it means that these are they're working on all these, excuse me, they're working on all of these kinds of things as parents. They've got a lot going on. There are priorities for them, even as they're thinking about what it means to be a parent and stuff that's important to them. Liseth, do we want to add anything to that?
Oh, I think you have stated well. I mean, to me, these findings are interesting, but not surprising, because we tend to all fall into this trap of separating spirituality from the mundane everyday activities, right? We tend to put them in a different bucket and maintain this perception that spiritual development pertains only to religious places, when in fact spiritual development is an innate process within the child, often independent of religious affiliation, but they must be nurtured. It must be pay attention to, and we have to support parents and adults around the child to be aware that all spiritual development is embedded in all the other the items that were rated high on that list that you presented.
Yeah, thanks. So, and that's really tied to even within what's happening within families. The research by many folks actually shows that a lot of what nurtures the spiritual lives of children and spiritual thriving is all of the things that make a family strong generally. And this goes back to a number of studies that basically say the quality of relationships within the family, how it does discipline in a way that's fair and reasonable with the children, and as Liseth said, is not punitive in the sense of a corporal punishment. that the family has a structure that is both structured and flexible, has rituals and routines that are meaningful, that's engaged in the community beyond it. These are all things that Vern Bankston and we at Search Institute have been talking about for 30 years around being important parts of creating a context within family where the spiritual life is nurtured. And then the practices of the family around the specific practices of family is also important. They're not guarantees, but they're things that can happen that can nurture the spiritual lives of children. So that stuff is just as important. And one of the things we find out from a lot of the parents we talk to and other studies have found is that parents today really struggle with, they want their kids to be able to make choices about their own spiritual paths. And they also have a lot of anxiety if kids go a direction that's not their own tradition. And so I love this from one of the people we talked to, is sort of like, how do you walk with children on their spiritual path rather than dragging them on yours? And it's just really an interesting way of thinking through what's the role of a parent in this whole piece when they're going to make, particularly during adolescence, begin making these choices. And sometimes more and more people don't have a way of, essentially forcing that. And yet they have a deep commitment to their own tradition, their own faith, and all of these things. And so there's important conversations for parents and faith communities to have. How do we think about that? How do we work on that? And that's a point of great anxiety for many parents. I'm thinking about how they deal with that. I want to move on so we have plenty of time to talk. Our last section is, what is the supportive institutions? How do we think about supportive institutions? And I'm making this broader than just faith communities, churches, mosques, synagogues, temples, and that, even though those are often the ones that have the most direct role, because there are other institutions that have a faith tradition or spiritual roots, and others that could, if we think about it broadly. So we're going to use supportive institutions for today. And you can think of yourself being in one of those wherever you're serving. So this is Michael mentioned at the beginning, this is statistics that keeps religious leaders up at night. If you go back to the 1970s, people, and Christian is what they have here because that was dominant. So apologies to those in other religious traditions, but you'll see that people identified, 80% of Americans identified as Christians, and back in the 1970s, and fewer than, I think it was about 80%, fewer than 20% identified as something else back in the 70s. And you'll see that in the 1990s, that number identified as Christian went down. These are the parents of this age group for the most part now. And there now is about as many people identify as having no religious tradition as those who identify as Christian. So this is a source of anxiety for many, and just put it out there. So the religious leaders, this is what they're worried about, for what that's worth. And so we want to just put that out there. And so how do we think about that? And so what are the mindset shifts that we have to think about? Because if religious leaders are just worrying about basically attendance and who's showing up, is that the message that is useful to families? Because it's really not focused on families. So when we talk to folks who are in religious institutions and families, some things started coming up. Is how do we think about being flexible, having the spaces for exploration for people who may now be a second or third generation that hasn't been active in a faith community or in a place where that's thinking about spirituality, where the stories, the narratives are not something that are familiar to them. And then how we think about moving from supporting to partnering. And so how do we begin moving to a different kind of relationship with families who may not see participation in a religious institution as just a thing you do anymore. So just to play a shift from Tanya Camden, who's down in Texas at the United Methodist Conference down there, and her perspective on this, I think, is just helpful.
I think families are looking for ways, how do we do this in the ordinary moments versus somebody saying you need to come to church 2 hours a week to check this box. But instead, I think families are really asking, like, knowing my family, knowing what's important to us, knowing our schedules, surely we can connect to God when we're together and we're not at the church.
Yeah, so she poses the question, doesn't give us a quick answer. But I guess, Lisette, do you want to comment on anything about the institutions and their roles in all of this?
Lisette, looks like you're muted. If you could unmute. Thank you.
Thank you. Apologies for that. You will think that after all this time, I should have mastered this. Well, let me just say that I do believe that institutions have play a key role in supporting parents. We know that promoting partnerships with parents, caregivers, and promoting family resiliency and connection is strongly associated with child flourishing and spiritual development. And if we are departing from this concept that you have been highlighting here, Jean, that spirituality is relational, then we really need to focus on that relationship with the parents. Because if we support them, then it was going to trickle down directly to the kid. So it's paramount that we provide support to the parents and that we support their own spiritual development, that we fill their tank. And, modeling is very powerful in that, to say that the parents are just going to be pushing down their own spirituality and beliefs to the kids, but they're going to model ethical ways of being in community. They're going to model how they are in touch with their spirituality, their deep sense of transcendence. They're going to model how to belong in a community and respect the image of God in others. And so we really need to focus on supporting those relationships, because that's the immediate avenue to supporting kids. I come from it from a more a prevention stance, and this is something that can be easily done within churches, can be done in school settings, in other ways. It's providing those venues where parents can talk about and discover and foster or challenge their own spirituality, and how that spirituality or theology of life really informs their parenting, how they can question, from their perspectives. With World Vision, in this program that I mentioned before, we have parents leverage their thinking and practices around parenting based on their spiritual belief that, listen, you all know that you are created in the image of God. And so that means that it has to be respected, nurtured, and they begin to see the child as one that has agency, voice, and that needs to be respected and cared for. I mean, as parents, we know that, but it is definitely emphasized in different ways. So we want to create those spaces for the parents to talk about their own spirituality in whatever shape or form, and to also heal and be accountable to each other together, to allow them to reflect back on how past experiences. You talk about personal experiences being a barrier in some families. Well, parents need to be able to dig a little bit into what happened to them and how they're kind of repeating this cycle with their kids. And it happens in community, happens in these spaces that institutions can create for parents to process these things and to be supported and held accountable by the rest of the community. I'll stop there because I know we're running out of time, but
Yeah, that's great.
Institutions creating spaces for parents to flourish too.
Yeah, so let's turn
I think-
to some conversation. I know there's some questions coming up in the chat and in the question space. So let's jump into some of those questions with folks. And at this point, we're as much in the questions as you are, but we'll talk more about what we're doing next as well. So let's jump in. Michael.
Well, thank you all for this really rich presentation, and for everyone in the chat. I hope you all go back through the timeline and see the comments people are asking and the questions people are asking. There is over 90 people here who are very interested in spiritual development of young people across the world. The people from everywhere from California to Norway to the Twin Cities and beyond. So I hope you feel that you're a part of a group of people who are asking these same questions. So some of the questions we were seeing roll up through the chat here. I wonder if the two of you could share more about how to practically support parents, especially if the parents don't have a clear comprehension of spirituality, or maybe they consider themselves spiritual but not religious. How would you recommend practically partnering with those parenting adults?
I mean, one thing I will say, and Liseth, you may have another perspective on it, is, well, first of all, that the project we're doing now is actually trying to answer that question much more robustly. We'll talk about that a little bit later. I think the idea that parents need to be the experts before they can be accompany their children in that journey is one that I would probably push back on, and basically saying, how can we be in dialogue with our kids and ask questions together and learn together and discover together, which I think kids actually enjoy and find valuable. When we did this in middle school, where kids said, you know, it means a lot to me when we had classes for kids and parents together, not in this particular topic, but around relationships. Kids said it meant a lot to me that my parents actually want to learn more too. And so us learning it together, it mattered to them. So there's something in that as well, is that if we can imagine that there's a discovery process for multiple generations together, and thinking about the intergenerational opportunities is one way to think about that.
Yeah. No, I agree. There needs to be spaces for parents to wrestle with their own spirituality and their own parenting, their own wounds in the context of supported group. And there is a place and a need for those conversations to happen between parent and child. So I think one of the other is that they don't cancel one another. They need to be happening. And we need to be mindful of that. I think in terms of, even if a parent does not endorse a religious belief or dismisses their spirituality, I think that we can begin to plant seeds around that. Every parent has a vision for the family, a vision for a hope for their offspring, that they'll be better, that the next generation will be better. And that's a form of spirituality. That's a tapping into transcendence, right? Continuity. And so you start really planting this hope and saying, you do have a vision for the future, a hope that is there. Let's talk about it. How do you see it happening? If we get stuck with religious language, we might dampen the process, but I think that we need to start fostering and nurturing that deep sense of hope for the future of their kids. And every parent has that. You can ask them, what is it that you want them to be? And they might say, I don't want them to be like me. Okay, well, that's a place to start. And what does that mean? And really begin to unfold their own theology and their own sense of spirituality and sense of purpose in life.
Seth, I heard you say supportive community, which ties in a little bit to one of the questions that was being asked about. Can you give some more practical examples of how supportive institutions can partner instead of support, that distinction of partnering? So I wonder, Jean and Seth, as you answer, if you might share a bit more about the recent retreat you went on in the project and what you learned from practitioners there about practical ways to partner instead of support.
I'll let you go first.
I can't remember my homework. What did we learn? But I think for me, thanks for highlighting this, Michael. I think partnering means you have to listen. You have to really sit down with the parents and let them tell you what is it that they want to learn. Oftentimes as practitioners, and myself included, as researchers, we think we know it all and we want to tell them what is good for them. Eat your vegetables and shut up kind of thing. But you know what? No, they have a lot to say. They have their own concerns. They have their own agendas. And oftentimes just hearing those agendas, it leads back to some of the essential issues that we have been talking about, some of the essential conditions that need to be happening for families and kids to flourish in every sense of the way, and especially in spirituality. So oftentimes you'll hear a parent, if you are talking about diverse groups, a parent who lives in a very low socioeconomic neighborhood, and they're facing all kinds of challenges due to poverty or perhaps violence. Their concern is not spirituality. Their concern is about survival. How do I keep my kids safe? How do I do this or that? Well, just start there. Start pushing down an agenda, and you start addressing some of these needs, and connecting them to some of these key conditions that need to happen in order for them to flourish spiritually as well.
Another question that we saw in the chat is, are there other research projects or support that you both know about for other potential diverse groups like Indigenous communities or neurodivergent children? I want to speak a little bit to that.
I'm not specifically aware of those specific groups, particularly at this age level. There's just not a lot of research happening at this age level. There may be others on the webinar who are aware of that. I wish there was. We're working with, doing some work with African-American Latina families, which we hope shed some light there, but there's such limited research generally. I'm just trying to think back to what I can, there is a literature, the literature we found is in the report that you'll receive after this webinar in the next couple of days, and that will have what we found, but I don't recall any specifically looking at families within those particular populations. So I wish I did know.
And if you do know, please share in the chat. This is an ongoing conversation. The webinar only scratches the surface of all the work that we're doing, both at Search Institute, at Fuller, and in your own institution. We have a few minutes left here. And so I did want to point out a few things, then we'll pass it over to Jean and Lisette for kind of the last word here. We have our resources hub. If Ella, you'll share that in the chat. Our resources hub, we are constantly updating that with new resources and activities and practical tools that you can use as you work with young people in their spiritual development and any kind of relationship building efforts you're doing. So we hope you take advantage of that. All that content is free. You will be getting the slide deck and additional resources about the project as a follow-up email. And also, I mentioned Ella. Ella is our partner relationship specialist. If some of this is stirring up questions for you that you just want to get more information about what Search Institute does, and you want to maybe consider partnering more directly, we welcome that. And so with that, with a few minutes left here, let's let Jean share a little bit more of the project out of which this research has come, and give Jean and Lisette the last word. So thank you all so much for being here.
Great. I see someone has, YDS has some stuff on neurodivergent neurodiverse youth, children. If you don't mind sharing that in the chat, that might be useful. We can get that out to people as well. So thank you for that. Let me just quickly talk about the project that we've launched that builds on what we found here. Assuming I can remember how to share my screen, I'll show you a couple of slides here. Oh, it's already sharing it. That's helpful. So we received another Lilly grant to work on spiritual thriving elementary families. And our sense was that we needed to really spend a good deal of time listening to families first before we would know what to do, how to really engage with them. And so we are working in 3 communities. Some folks on the call are from some of those communities. Good to see you guys. Using a human-centered design process, which has these phases, and we're still in the first phase, where we're working with African American, Latina, and low income families in San Antonio, Pasadena, and Lynchburg, Virginia, to really try to understand their lived experience, their thoughts around spiritual development and children and families, and then ideate some tools and test them with prototypes with them until we find tools that really resonate with families and help the families grow around spirituality. And we're going to have we're working on this for 3 years. So, and those tools will become available more broadly over time. And hopefully we'll learn through that project more about what it takes to really connect with families, particularly within those cultural groups, and also with families who are less connected to religious institutions. So that's an ongoing process that we're really just in the first early stages of, that I hope will be valuable to you. And we'll be reporting out on that over time as we go along. We'll be building a online community of practice for people who work with families and children, where you'll be able to participate in that as we go along. So that's our big piece here. And like I said, we've got a while to work on that. So that's where we're going with the project. Seth, I don't know if there are other things you want to add about that. We're in the process of developing a series of tools. We had a retreat where we brought together scholars, practitioners, and families for 2 days to really dig into what we needed to do, how we needed to do it, and we worked collaboratively on that. So it was really exciting to do that with families, with people who are working with families, and then with scholars to sort of come together and say, what does this look like, and how do we understand where to go with this? So that's the approach we're trying to use, is to have all the stakeholders working together in a room together. I think we're about out of time. After Mike, I don't know if you want to say anything else before we wrap
Yeah,
up.
we maybe as a way to wrap up, we only have a minute left, and I would love to hear from Jean, Seth, if you would share with us what your hopes are for the spiritual development of children as a way to close us out today. Thank you all so much for attending today. And Seth and Jean, we look forward to hearing you for the final remarks.
I think my hope is that we continue to challenge one another to think holistically, not to think spirituality as a separate bucket, but to think that spirituality is part of holistic development of children. And that we have to be cognizant that there are essential conditions that must be taking place for this flourishing of in this development to advance faster. And there are barriers, and as adults I believe we ought to be removing barriers and giving access to empowering opportunities where children can practice these ethical values, where children can explore their spirituality and their awareness of the divine. And that as adults, then we have to be the ones providing that safe environment, that nurturing environment where the children can really feel like they belong, and that they do have that sacred innate spirituality within them and in others. So I think we tend to often separate the physical from the emotional from the spiritual, but they're also intertwined. And I really want to continue challenging one another, that we all, adults, older adults, young adults, every institution has something to contribute to the spirituality of children if we focus on some of these 3 conditions that we have been talking about. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Liseth. And I would second that and just say, I would love for us to find ways to be open and listen to children and families, and out of that, let new things happen and see what happens. And so I appreciate the opportunity to be with you guys today, and hope that as you continue the work, that we'll discover new ways to connect with children and families around the spiritual lives of kids. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Liseth and Jean, for sharing this wisdom with us today. And we are grateful that you are here, and please check your inbox for follow-up information and resources about this topic. Have a great day, everyone.